Okay, so this is the big question that the global economy faces this week, is whether or not, or indeed over the next few weeks, is whether or not Iran and or its proxies are able to disrupt the shipping of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a relatively thin channel that passes along the southern coast of Iran from the Persian Gulf into the Gulf of Oman. And that's how... So normally about 20 million barrels of oil a day and about 10 million cubic feet of gas go through that on ships every single day. So that's probably about, a fifth to a quarter of the world's energy exports, depending how much everyone else is exporting at the time. So it's hugely important because the price of energy is the price of everything. And what we're already seeing is there are ships being... having their GPS jammed in the Strait, which could be a prelude to, sort of attacks on ships, which have happened before in the past. And there could also be things like hijackings. Obviously, if ships are having their GPSs jammed, then there's increased likelihood of, sort of disruption or even collisions and things like that. And these are enormous ships. But that's not the only thing that could happen to the oil trade as a result. So it's not. So, for example, a couple of people have said to me, one of the really serious things that isn't being considered as much is the possibility that Israel could strike Iran's export facility. So almost all of Iran's oil, which is a lot, it's one of the world's biggest oil producers and has some of the world's biggest oil reserves, is all exported from this place called Karg Island. And which is in the Persian Gulf. And were they to strike that would have a significant impact on oil. And then they might respond not just by attacking the Strait of Hormuz, but also by attacking oil facilities in Iraq as well. So there is potential for escalation against oil facilities all around the region, and that would have broad geopolitical effects because of the economic effects it would have, particularly on, for example, China, which buys almost all of Iran's oil and also is the biggest buyer of the oil that comes through the Strait. But actually, some other countries, most notably the US, would be all right because
they've got their own.
Yeah, they've got their own oil, and they can. America is almost uniquely positioned to increase its oil supply, its oil production more quickly than anyone else. They recently decreased it by about 200,000 barrels a day, so they can ramp it up quite quickly. So there is a kind of sense that actually, the escalation is not entirely against America's interests, depending on how you look at America's interests.
And Tom, it wouldn't just be a response against America, as Will said. It would be China would be impacted, the other Gulf states would be impacted, we would be impacted as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is listening to Will there. It's extraordinary that, in a sense, we're talking about decisions that the Israelis could take, which would, in effect, be hitting China's oil resources. That is an escalation that into territory that I don't think any of us can quite comprehend what that means, because China is not involved in any sense sort of militarily or involved really in trying to bring this to a settlement. It kind of is quite distant from what is going on, but it is nevertheless impacted. And I think this sort of raises quite a few interesting questions, geopolitical questions. As Will was saying, we are directly impacted by this. If any of these things that you have set out is to happen, then our economy is going to be smashed, just as it was in the 70s when we had an oil spike in 73 and Edward Heath was kicked out less than a year later. So these things have a direct impact on us, but we have almost no agency here at all. And even if you cast your mind back to 2003 with the Iraq War, we were, at least in some senses, listened to. There was an attempt to go through the UN. That is all being cast aside here. This is a decision taken on the whims of one or two men, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, over which we have no influence, it seems, but we are going to take the brunt of the consequences in a way that the Americans don't seem effectively insured against, whereas not just Britain, but the entire European continent seems completely exposed and powerless at the same time.
And obviously, if China's oil supply is hit, China an ally of Iran, but that does filter down very quickly to global supply chains and to the cost of goods here in Britain.
Yeah. So obviously, a lot of what we buy here in the UK is made in factories in China. So if you raise the price of energy for those factories and the price of plastic, which is also oil to those factories, then that becomes consumer price inflation in the UK. But I mean, you would see it even more quickly than that because petrol prices at the pump would go up. Our electricity price is set by the price of wholesale gas. So even though it's even electricity from renewable sources, the overall price is set by the price of wholesale gas. So we would see that in our electricity bills. And you would see it in the price of food, which is made out of, fertilizer is made out of gas. So you would, you would see a significant impact on the UK economy. One person I spoke to recently said, if you have some disruption of the Strait, but if the military vessels that are there now are able to sort of secure convoys through, and you have some disruption of some other oil facilities, then you might get enough impact for a noticeable effect, perhaps enough to push us into recession, but perhaps not that bad. I mean, but if you get weeks-long serious disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, then they said you might get a similar size price shock to what we had in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, and that in that year the UK had to commit to spending an extra 52.2 billion on supporting businesses and households with their energy bills, just for the energy bills, not all the other impacts of price inflation that happened as a result. And our Prime Minister in that year lasted just over a month. Lots of government plans had to be torn up. We're still living with the impact today. So another shock of that size would have really, really serious impacts for UK.
Isn't that kind of one of the forgotten bits of the Liz Truss sort of episode? Yeah. Is that the biggest bill in her, what was it called? Her mini budget.
Mini budget.
That was the support that she was giving to households.
Which she didn't even want to do, but she had to because the situation for households had got so dire.
Yeah. And she went further than the predecessor were willing to go. She sort of said, well, we'll give everybody everything, right? And then that was one of the causes of the crisis. Yeah.
So, the kind of panic in bond markets that deposed her had already begun as a result of the UK effectively committing to unlimited borrowing because she had committed to spending whatever it took to ensure that people's energy bills were kept to a certain level. That's when the yield started to rise on gilts.
So since we're casting our minds back to Russia and Ukraine, obviously there is a Russian angle to this as well because if the price of oil shoots up, Moscow benefits. And Tom, do you also think it sends a bit of a signal to Putin or to the world? Putin claimed that his invasion of Ukraine was in part to stop Ukraine developing nuclear weapons. Is there a kind of American hypocrisy angle here that could be damaging in geopolitical terms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the charge of hypocrisy has obviously been there for 20 years or so now, probably longer. You could trace it back at least to the invasion of Afghanistan, but certainly from Iraq onwards. But it seems almost beyond hypocrisy now. It seems that Trump himself doesn't make any kind of pretense about this is to export liberal democracy or protect the rules-based order. We seem to have entered a world which it's almost sort of unmasked, that what we have and what matters is power, and that if you have the power, you get to impose your will. And at the moment, that is the United States and Israel can impose its will, and they seem not to care about the opinion of those without power to impose their will, principally Europe, and I think they've been very clear about that. And as you say, you get these a kind of remarkable convergence of the logic behind the Russian invasion and the American attack, or the more, I suppose, the Israeli attack, which is there is a danger to our security close to us that we have the ability to impose our will upon them. And so we will do so, whether that is Russia or that is Israel. I think what is remarkable in some sense here is that the actor that's driving this is Israel and the figure of Benjamin Netanyahu. This is still a relatively small country that requires I think it's a $3 billion military subsidy from the United States every year to be able to have the military that it has. And yet, in a sense, it seems to be the one leading the United States foreign policy. Because if we are to believe what Donald Trump has been saying, he is not actively pursuing this. But as with each step that Netanyahu takes and he creates the opening, he has effectively created this opening and said, "Are you really going to miss this? Here you go. Here's your opportunity to go and do what all of your predecessors have not done." Netanyahu is sort of politically the big winner here. I mean, he has got everything he's dreamed of for 20 years, and Trump himself looks a bit shaky on TV, like he's not quite himself in how he's talking about this. And now he's starting to talk about regime change, which is exactly the opposite of what he was talking about in the presidential election. Perhaps that won't matter. I think we had a podcast out yesterday in which Freddie Hayward and Lee Siegel were talking about this exact question and whether any of this will matter to Trump's base or not, or whether this is about the whims of personalities and that is at the core of the kind of populist appeal. And what we have is Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, Vladimir Putin, President Xi, and we over here in our kind of messy democracies trying to come up with diplomatic communiques in Vienna and elsewhere just look almost sort of as if history has passed us by.
You say Trump looks a bit shaky on this, but there was a diplomatic effort to constrain Iran under Barack Obama, the 2015 Iran deal, which Trump then tore up in 2018. So do you think escalation and further American involvement, the groundwork for it was in fact laid back then, and that there was some kind of intention towards this point?
I personally wonder whether we can read too much sort of intention into these, as if Trump is a sort of grand chess master, or that he acts on impulse as events move, and that actually the key to being able to influence Trump is to change the chessboard to your benefit and then get him to go and make the move for you, which is what Netanyahu seems to have done. But it is certainly true, as you say, that he blew up an accord and a strategy that was backed by the United States, Russia, and the European Union. This was a multi-year effort to bring something together. You talk to people inside the Foreign Office. They were absolutely wedded to this, just as other people had worked to build the Paris Climate Accords, blown up by Donald Trump. So this man is shaping the world in ways that are sort of permanent and ongoing, and we shouldn't sort of underplay. And so he has blown something up that he has then created the world that has given him the opportunity to do what he has done now. But I think in ways that I'm not sure he's in control of. As Will was saying, he doesn't get to decide how Iran responds or what China does. And I was speaking to people who were quite concerned about what was going on, and they pointed out that, it was Britain and the United States not long ago who intervened to try to defeat the Houthis in Yemen when they were also trying to block the trade routes through this part of the world, an Iranian proxy. And we launched missiles at the Houthis. They're not even in control of their country, which is less powerful than Iran. And we weren't successful because they are using relatively cheaply made drones to divert shipping through this part of the world. And we are replying with incredibly expensive weapons. So it's this kind of, it's an imbalanced war effort. Now, Iran is so much more powerful than the Houthis. They have more options. Now, we don't know how powerful they are, but already you see the sort of escalating talk in the United States. So I think there are certainly more dangers, escalating dangers.
And well, is there anything that the UK government could do right now, rather than go back in time and insulate our economy better, to help protect us from the shock that could be coming?
Build nuclear power stations 20 years ago. I think, in a way, the UK government is, in a sense, doing some of the right things in that we are investing a lot of money in producing our own energy. And that is, this just underscores what an important effort that is, because I think you could argue that, this situation tells you something about a sort of grimy truth about the oil-based or fossil fuel-based global economy, which is that whenever it creates opportunities for people like Trump to create chaos and for their countries to profit from it financially. So, there's always a kind of a trade-off that is, not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily cost them anything. And we need to, I think, arrange things for our energy security such that we are more insulated against those kinds of shocks. The problem is we don't really have space to do so because we didn't do so in the past. So whenever a shock like this comes along, it's going to really impact how much the government can spend and how much it can borrow, because it will be busy coping with the consequences.